Hello, everyone, and welcome to Small Screen Star Wars. As always, I'm Julian Mush, and I am not joined by Rachel Wilkinson today. Unfortunately, it's just myself today. She's on vacation, and this actually is a little bit of a throwback because the very first episode of Small Screen Star Wars, or at least the very first episode of the Bad Batch recaps for Small Screen Star Wars, was just myself before Rachel came on. So if you enjoyed that, you'll enjoy this. And to be fair, to this week's episode, we're going to be talking about the Bad Batch Season 1, Episode 13, Infested. To be fair to this week's episode, it's not the strongest of the episodes of the season so far, now with only 3 episodes left. We're kind of into the final stretch, and I would be surprised if those last 3 episodes weren't kind of all one big arc anyway. But this episode's very standalone. You could basically watch it completely out of context and not really have to, not really miss anything or not much of anything. So that's good, and that means that for an episode that's just me talking, we're not going to have to really dissect, or I'm not really going to have to dissect too much, and this should be a fairly quick episode. So stick around. We're going to get to that in just a second. Before we do, though, let me remind you to follow us on Twitter at TowerBabbleCast, Facebook.com/TowerBabbleCast, and head over to TowerOfBabble.ca or SmallScreenStarWars.com to find everything that we do, including the flagship show, the Tower of Babble Podcast. And if you want to help support this show, as well as the Tower of Babble Podcast, or either or, you can head over to Patreon.com/TowerBabbleCast, and for as little as $5 a month, you can, again, support the show and get access to a monthly film club. So we do, every month, it's kind of like a book club, but for movies. And we kind of get together and we try to pick movies that we haven't seen for a long time or have personal favorites from long ago, maybe smaller films. So the movie that we picked this month is Driven, which is a Sly Stallone picture. And we're going to be recording that in the next couple of days because we do them once a month and usually typically around the end of the month. So stick around for that. And again, you can find that at our Patreon. Okay, let's get into this. Again, we're talking about the Bad Batch Season 1, Episode 13, Infested. Last week, I kind of suspected it's probably going to have something to do with bugs or something. I was not wrong. I was not wrong. And actually, that might have been Rachel that said that. I don't recall. But either way, it's unfortunate that it's not a little bit more creative of a name for a title, especially because, like, really as cool as the creatures are in this episode, they're really not that awesome because we barely even see them. We barely even get to see them up close, unless you're like really like freeze framing it. And it's just kind of like a plot element. Like they don't really play much of a larger role than that, and that's fine. But again, it's just, it's fairly easy to predict what we're getting with here. With the way they set up kind of the strings and the webs kind of that are in that hive, I was like, ooh, are we going to be dealing with those spiders from Mando season 2 again? And the answer is no, obviously. But I think that would have been fun and cool as a kind of a connection there, at least making it a little bit more interesting. Unfortunately, again, that's just not what we're dealing with. So we start at Ord Mantell, and we start with an establishing shot of Ord Mantell City. And we've seen this a bunch of times, but I really like the musical cue here, and the city looks really good. So, tip of the hat to that. The squad lands in one of the bays and gets off the ship, grumbling about a previous mission. Sid apparently left out information again, which will come into play later again this episode, but also calling back to when they were sent to rescue Jabba's Rancor, and they weren't told that it was a Rancor at all. This time, she didn't tell them that there was a bunch of Gundarks at their drop zone. That's what they said. We actually have seen Gundarks before. They've been referenced many times, including in Empire Strikes Back by Han, but also in the prequels, and we actually see them in the Clone Wars, and they're kind of like a giant bat multi-armed creature. So that would have been fun to see. Unfortunately, that's not what we're dealing with this episode. So as they walk back to town, back to Sid's parlor, they notice a bunch of people in kind of like this dark armor with this kind of like, I think, fairly cool helmet. And they arrive back at Sid's parlor, and it's swarming with people. These kind of same, and also those, by the way, those same armored folks are there we see two pikes walking out of the back room, and you're like, okay, what's that mean? And again, so this episode, I think, rewards a lot of longtime viewers of Star Wars stuff. Have you been watching the Clone Wars? Have you been watching, have you been paying attention in the Bad Batch? Because that stuff's going to pay off here for little things like just at this moment here, we see the pikes leaving, and you're like, oh, that's probably a bad sign. But if you weren't watching the Clone Wars, you might not pick up on that. And by the way, neither does Hunter or anyone else pick up on that because they don't recognize them either. The one thing that stands out to me here is that Hunter is once again being really myopic about their payment. Like, he's like, oh, I don't care how busy it is in here or where everyone is because as long as we get paid, And this has, I think, been a character flaw of his for a while, which is that he's kind of very, he sticks to his guns, but he's easily convinced, which is to kind of see the larger picture when someone presents that information to him. He's not really able to think through these things on his own or jump to these conclusions on his own, which can be good and bad in certain circumstances. Anyway, so he tells them they get to the back room and they're stopped by two guards who confront them. They quickly knock them out and they burst into Sid's office to find two more guards, and they've pulled their blasters and there's a bit of a standoff. And we see that there's now a Deveronian. By the way, this is creatures we've seen before that kind of look like a devil, basically, with two horns. This is a green one. And we later learn that his name is Roland Durand, but for now we don't know his name. And he tells them that Sid is out, quote unquote, and the planet and the parlor are now his territory. He also has the pet lizard Ruby, who we originally saw at the beginning of a previous episode, kind of similar to the way this episode starts with them chatting about other stuff, but we pick up in the middle of an episode of a mission earlier in the season, and they're actually rescuing Sid, or Ruby, sorry, for Sid, and there's a client who's paying for it, and it turns out that client was actually Roland the whole time. So that's kind of, again, another one of those callbacks. Again, have you been paying attention to what's going on in Bad Batch? Because there's these little callbacks that, again, aren't really necessary. You don't need to know them, but, again, are rewarding if you have been. And surprisingly, Ruby plays a large role in this episode, which, I don't think anyone saw coming. So Roland offers the squad work, basically saying, hey, listen, if Sid's just because Sid's not here doesn't mean I can't, get you some work, right? You could be useful to me. Just basically trying to buy their services. And I don't know if it's tough to say. Like, if let's assume that Roland had stepped into this position earlier and that they didn't know Sid, would the Bad Batch have agreed to work for him instead of Sid? Maybe at that time, potentially. It's a bit of a moot point, obviously. But this Hunter's like, well, think about it, which is actually, by the way, the same thing that they said to Sid, but they came around on her and she on them. And I think they're just picking up on much worse vibes from Roland here. So the next move that Hunter wants to make is to leave Ord Mantell immediately. And I, by the way, for the record, think that's actually a smart move. If you're being, if you're trying to be smart and play this game correctly, you don't mess around. You don't stick around when your work has been upended by some other crime boss. You leave. It's not a great plan to stick around. So, but Omega insists that they have to at least find Sid and help her. Fortunately, Sid overhears this as they arrive at their ship, and I guess maybe she thought they would do the same thing and didn't want them to leave without talking to her. So she's kind of taken up residence there. And by the way, so has the regulars Bolo and Ketch, who we typically always see at her bar, but they're actually playing cards on top of the Gonk droid here, which I think is kind of a funny little touch. Anyway, so she explains who Roland is. So he's a former client of hers and the son of a crime boss named Issa Durand. And I guess all this really says is that nepotism takes you a long way. But really, I think what's going on here and what's fascinating is that we knew that Sid was an informant for the Jedi, right? So she's quote-unquote a good guy, but she was always in the gray area, right? The Empire's arrival really signals to the underworld, and we know this through other mediums, through Solo, through the books and comic books, but is also with the dealings with Maul that we've had, that with the power vacuum that the Empire creates, removing kind of these typical normal positions of power, the underworld steps in to fill it. And this is an example of that. So Sid kind of, again, she's just playing by the rules that she's always known, but the rules have changed. So, Roland has stepped in to quote unquote fill the void. The Durans feel like they can make a play for more power. She's kind of an easy domino, and we don't know necessarily how Issa feels about her son. Does she consider Roland to be capable? Does she have multiple sons? We don't know that information, but I'm imagining that that stuff is going to play into it later. Typically in this type of stuff, the way that this is set up and plays out at the end, Roland is probably the kind of the ugly duckling, quote unquote, the runt of the litter, and he was kind of offered an easy position. He plays it very cool early in this episode, and I'm going to be honest, I was like, okay, this is pretty impressive. I like the voice actor here, but by the end, he's really dejected. He's really kind of not feeling it, and I get the impression that maybe he's not as well equipped for this as maybe he thought he was. So he wants to make a name for himself by joining up with the Pikes, which again is another signal that he's maybe trying to prove something to his parents. And we know about the Pikes because, well, for a lot of reasons, they appear in Solo. They look a little different in Solo, but they also make a major appearance in Clone Wars Season 7 with the Martez sister arc. And I know, and I was a vocal. I didn't love that arc in Season 7, and of course the Martez sisters came back in the Bad Batch earlier this season, and that's fine and all. But I guess what's most interesting that came out of that was that we found out a bit more about the Pikes, and we know that they kind of have stepped up to try to take over the Spice game, and we know by the time of Solo, which I feel like is only a few years later than this, that they've fully running the Spice game, and they're running the Spice mines on Kessel. So there you go. By the way, of course, Spice a reference to Dune and the Spice melange. Okay. Apparently, the other thing that comes of this is apparently find out that Ord Mantell is a valuable smuggling hotspot. It's in the center of multiple hyperspace lanes. This, by the way, explains why Han he was the original character to ever utter the name Ord Mantell also in Empire, and he was a smuggler, so it explains why he might have spent time there, because it's a smuggling haven if it's in the middle of these kind of valuable hyperspace lanes, and again explains why the Pikes would be involved. Okay, so Sid asks for their help, again, but she uses threats again, saying, she's been really great at keeping secrets. She's not very good at making friends, obviously. But Omega helps to convince Hunter and the rest to help her anyway, and Hunter reluctantly agrees, because this is what I mean. He's very, it seems like every time someone presents an opportunity to him, he's like, no. And then someone convinces her, typically Omega, and he's like, okay, I'll do it. And then it works out. But again, this is Star Wars. So here's the plan. They're going to steal a shipment of spice that is being kept in Sid's back office, and sabotage the deal that Roland made with the Pikes. We know, by the way, that the Pikes don't take kindly to missing shipments. They're very ruthless. You could just go back to that Martez sisters arc again, where they dump the quote unquote, they dump the spice and they have to deal with that. They get imprisoned for that, and locked up. So there is no getting rid of the spice. It's too valuable. Someone has to pay. So her plan is to take the spice. This will cause the Pikes to come down hard on Durand, and then she can clean up the mess and swoop in and take her parlor back. It seems like a decent plan, but the kind of important part is that no one can know they're involved. The reason for that is the Pikes are too dangerous. They don't want anyone to know that they were involved, because if they do, Pikes could come after them, and they're, again, like I said, the ruthless is dangerous. So that's the plan. So into the tunnels they go. They climb into a mining tunnel under the city to sneak into her parlor. They can't use the engines on these mine carts that they're going to use to kind of travel through the tunnels. She's saying that it's a stealth mission. Again, she's still not quite fully revealing all the information here. And of course, the first thing that anyone thinks of when they see minecarts in this type of stuff, especially in Star Wars, in kind of its adjacent position is Temple of Doom, Indiana Jones Temple of Doom, which has an infamous minecart sequence. So as they approach this kind of door, Sid reveals that the tunnels have a quote-unquote slight infestation problem and tells them all to be quiet. They have to keep their voices down. It's just like she's really like, I mean, you're at the door. Why wouldn't you give them as much information here as possible so that they can be fully prepared? What are you good? Like, what's the worst? I mean, I guess she doesn't want them to turn back, but I don't know. She just is a bit of a slime ball sometimes. So anyway, they enter this chamber, and the music gets really creepy, and you really get to see the dynamic lighting that they're now using in Bad Batch to its fullest extent. I think if you look back at early Clone Wars or even mid Clone Wars, they're not using dynamic lighting, and you can really tell everything's kind of very flatly lit, and even dark sequences especially dark sequences don't really look as good. You know, using flashlights, it's very much like a spotlight on a stage, and it doesn't. There's no ambiance. There's no light bouncing off of anything. Here, you're getting a lot of really cool ambient lighting and light bouncing off of interesting things, and we get kind of this look at these webs and the little stringy. It's very creepy. I think they do a good job with that, at least. Wrecker gets spooked. He accidentally drops his flashlight, although they call it a torch later, which is a very British thing to do. Luckily, this time nothing happens. They all go. This is, by the way, this is typical kind of like first act. You don't reveal this yet. You don't want to do that. It's too early to reveal the monster, but still creepy as hell. Especially, by the way, the sound work for these bug creatures is very good. I find it to be really unsettling, and I don't enjoy it. I have a arachnophobia, so this kind of stuff really kind of gets to me. I don't really like it at all. But anyway, again, kudos. I think it's effective. So anyway, nothing happens. They get through the chamber. They close the door behind them, and they reach a ladder that takes them up into the office. Tech, rightfully so, asks how they'll know if it's clear to grab the spice. How do they know if anyone's in the office? Sid has a plan. She's going to distract Roland and his guards by using the regulars, Bolo and Ketch, to kidnap Ruby. And so she like sends a signal, and they use Mantel Mix to lure Ruby outside, and then they drop a cage on her and run away. It's not really the most high-tech plan. Roland, of course, he's like, where is she? Where's my pet? He orders his guards to go look for them, for Ruby, and that clears out the office. So the squad heads up and grabs the spice. There's this kind of brief moment where they are like, wow, it's really messy here. We see these kind of like rat-like creatures. I'm not sure if that's to imply that Sid is messy, or that Roland has taken over and it's now messy because he's there. It's not clear. I don't know. It's kind of a throwaway line. Meanwhile, Bolo and Ketch are they accidentally drop the cage after Ruby bites their finger, and this releases Ruby. Unfortunately, they are also spotted as this happens, and the guards chase after them. And Ruby makes her way back to Roland, and there's this kind of really cute scene where he rubs her belly. And I think this is one of the first moments where you're really seeing like a soft spot from him. And either way, I think what you do get to see is how cute Ruby is again, and that does not disappoint, in my opinion. Clearly not my favorite character on the show, but I got to appreciate that they made a lizard very cute, because I don't find lizards typically to be very cute. So Roland starts to head back to his office. Now, a little bit of a critique or a nitpick, maybe you could call it here, is that typically when this type of thing starts to happen, where like you're sneaking in, or if this is in a heist situation where you're heisting something, the pressure starts to amp up as we cut back and forth between them doing the thing and stealing the thing, and the person who they're stealing from coming back to the thing that they're stealing, right? That's classic heist movie stuff. I don't think that they do that very effectively here. There's the pressure doesn't really ramp up ever. There's this line from Echo, "You'll seal the door," right? So that doesn't seem to stop them either. So it's like it's just kind of I feel like a missed opportunity to do something a little bit more exciting here, and maybe have it a little bit closer to them being caught. I mean, I guess it is pretty close considering they get out just in time. But again, I don't really feel the what's the word I'm looking for here? Pressure is not the right word, but that's basically what I'm getting at. The suspense. So they get all the spice out, and what I find odd here is that, okay, so Roland obviously quick to discover that the spice is missing, but also quick to discover this hidden hatch. He guess he knew it was there the whole time, which I guess is kind of like a design, like, why didn't you lock that? It's kind of weird to me if he knew it was there. But if he didn't know it was there, he sure finds it really fast. And I guess the story is just not interested in exploring that. But again, it's just one of those things where, like, you know, as an audience member, you're just like, wow, okay, that's weird that he found it so fast. And not that I want them to spend a lot of time on it, but at least, you know, a line of dialogue to explain it goes a long way there. So, So he sends his guards to chase them, and then we get this minecart chase sequence, which, for my money, I think is probably this reason this episode exists at all. They wanted to do a minecart sequence, and this allows them to do it. And I'll give them props for at least having them stick to Ord Mantell. We don't spend a lot of time there, you know, not a lot anyway. It's just kind of the bookends, typically, the episodes. So being able to say, okay, well, we'll just do a mission at Ord Mantell, and we want to do a minecart sequence anyway, so how do we explain that? Well, we'll invent this kind of infestation story. Okay, fair enough. So this is kind of the quote-unquote like action set piece that's the most exciting, and so they're going and they're using those hand crank things. By the way, I like that this is kind of like classic minecart because, you know, of course, when you think of like Old West and you think of those hand cranks, it's like they're standing on a train track and they're cranking up and down. That's the same thing here, but because the minecart's flipped upside down and it's hanging off of a monorail, you're cranking up and down, but the thing is on top. So I just like the design of it. I think that's kind of cool. So they're doing that because they want to be quiet, but because they didn't really get away with very much time, the guards chase them, and they use the engines on these minecarts, which are actually quite loud, which is what Sid was worried about. And I got to appreciate, get a call out, or at least give props to the sound design on those engines. I think it's just like, it's another really great sound design element from Star Wars. It's certainly not up there with some of the best, but I think it fits really well, and I think it's kind of cool sounding. So they start firing blasters at them. The squad starts firing back, and there's a couple kind of clever minecart crash techniques. There's this one that stands out to me, which is where Hunter kind of like jumps over to one of the other minecarts and then knocks out the people on board and then sends it in reverse and then jumps back to the one he was just on, causing the minecart to crash into the one that's behind them. And knocking them all off. And this by the way, this clears out the first batch of bad guys that are following them, and they're like, oh man, really hope that the noise that they caused didn't wake up the hive. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It does wake up the hive, and it sends these insect-like, bat-like creatures after them, and they're called Earlings. We find out later that they're called Earlings. And the creature design here is kind of cool as it is. It's kind of this half bat, half like I don't know. Again, insect, and they explode in green. Like they kind of pop and explode like in green, kind of like an insect. But again, they look more bat-like. I think this is really disgusting. But again, we don't really get to see them. They're supposed to be really big, but I think the way that they're shown here in context doesn't make them appear as scary or as big as they maybe are. And that might be partially due to the sound design there as well. The wing flaps feel very small. So, and they kind of remind me of Geonosians a little bit, but more fleshy, if that makes it grosser, which I think it does. So more that, just as they're being attacked by these Earlings, more guards follow them, but they're quickly taking out. By the way, there's a lot of brutal deaths here for these guards, falling off to their death from these mine carts and being, I don't know, maybe eaten by these Earling creatures. It's unsettling to think about. So the squad is also attacked by them, and luckily they're kind of smart enough to use their flashlight to scare them off, and they're a good enough shot that they're able to take out most of the ones that get close to them. But they also lose. They have to jump off one of the minecarts as the Earlings take it out, and they lose the spice. All 6 crates of spice are lost with them, and they're trapped in that cavern with the Earlings. So they seal the door, they seal the Earlings in, and so they're fine. And it's funny here because there's this line from Omega. She's like, well, at least we got rid of the spice, which reminds me of, again, the Martez sisters arc when they dump the spice, and it doesn't go quite as smoothly as they hoped. So back at Sid's, and back at the parlor, Roland is interrogating Bolo and Ketch, who are obviously caught because they're pretty incompetent. And they put up very little resistance and give up Sid right away, promising that they were never going to hurt Ruby. It was all just a distraction, yada, yada, yada. And, before he can deal with them, because, by the way, early in the episode, he did say that they would capture and kill them. So, I mean, Bolo and Ketch maybe get away with one here because they're interrupted by 2 Pikes arriving looking for the spice. So here's the thing. If the 2 Pikes that arrive at, that we see leaving Sid's at the beginning of this episode are dropping off the spice, or they're there to make the deal, and then they're already back to collect payment, it seems like it's happening a little fast. Now, of course, we don't know that for sure, and of course, Sid has this intel, so maybe it didn't happen that quickly, but again, very convenient that the Pikes are back so soon, and they're looking for the spice. Roland admits, and by the way, I think shockingly, he admits that the shipment was stolen and asks for more time. The Pikes are not interested in excuses. They're not happy, and they basically threaten him, and they say, like, hey, if you're not going to sort this out, you're not useful to us anymore. Roland tries to stand firm, threatening them with his blaster, telling them to, go back to Obadiah. By the way, we've been there. That's where we were in season 7 of Clone Wars. The Pikes aren't really phased, though, and tell him that he's, quote-unquote, out of his depth, and threaten his entire family if he doesn't fix this. Now, this is, again, where that example of, or where I'm kind of picking up on this idea that Roland is maybe kind of the runt of the litter, that he's trying to make this kind of big, bold play, and to kind of work with the Pikes to impress his mom, but ultimately he is out of it. He is in over his head, and he's not ready to deal with this. He didn't have plans to handle what happens if when you oust Sid. How do you deal with that if you're trying to deal with this kind of much more complicated plan with the Pikes? He didn't consider that, and this put him into this position. So that, anyway, just something to think about. So, cut to Sid, and the squad is arriving back at the parlor. Apparently, they heard that the Pikes had already been there. Again, there's these quick time jumps, so it's really kind of hard to tell exactly how much time is going by here. Like, okay, they lost the spice, and then they got back up to the surface. Now, did they hear almost immediately that the Pikes were there? And if that's the case, when they arrive, there's like men littered across the floor. All of Roland's kind of guards are all over the floor. Are they dead? It's not clear. I mean, it's kind of implied that they are. But Sid is a little hasty, at least, to she starts celebrating. See, I told you my plan would work, and it was sooner than I expected. But just as she's doing that, Roland is escorted out of the back in binders by the Pikes, and he right away fingers them for the theft of the spice. He knew they were going to come back and was just waiting, and said, hey, no, it was them who took it. Now, I give credit to this show because I think the Pikes are fairly even keeled here. They offer a deal. They say, hey, you know what? Return the spice, and we'll consider the issue resolved. No harm, no foul. Now, what I like here is that they're basically holding Roland responsible for this fuck up, and that they don't really care how it's solved, and they don't necessarily believe Roland that it was them who did it. But it doesn't matter to them. They need to get their stuff back. That's really all they care about. So they're willing to cut a deal. Now, it would have been suck if they weren't involved. Much harder for them, which is something we've seen before. But they do know they are involved. The Pikes call Sid's bluff, and they offer to keep Omega as collateral as they go collect the payment. Now, what I actually really like here is that the squad, as soon as they say that, all pull their blasters and point them at the Pikes. Now, the Pikes, both when Roland pointed their blasters and this time, are just not fazed by having guns pointed at them. So I just think that's just like a really badass thing, is not to be phased when someone pulls a gun on you. Pretty cool. So again, they pull the squad, and even again here, when they hear that they want to keep Omega as collateral, they pull their guns and their blasters, excuse me. And it's just a quick like show don't tell situation where like, hey, again, you might be able to see this episode out of context, but you know that the Omega is important to them because that idea alone is enough to cause them to pull guns, and like we're not even going to entertain that. Of course, Sid plays referee, reminds them who they're dealing with. Again, the Pikes world renowned, or galaxy renowned for being ruthless, and says convinces them to kind of stand down. So we cut away and we're back outside, and the squad are now pissed because they had to leave Omega behind. But they discuss the plan to retrieve the spice. Now, again, this is not much of a it's still ultimately a Star Wars show. So how much time it can spend on this idea, this moral kind of quandary of should they have left her behind at all? And in real life, if that had happened, is what's the outcome? Are they really going to murder this little girl? Like I don't know, but what I'm saying is they don't spend any time with dealing with these ideas, which is probably for the best because it is ultimately somewhat a kids show still. Anyway, so Tech reveals that the creatures were in fact Earlings from before, so now we get the name brought in, and they're sensitive to light and suggest that they should act before nightfall. So I guess they don't have a lot of time. Sid's plan is that her and Wrecker will rappel down into the cavern and retrieve the spice. And she proclaims, and I think in kind of one of the few moments where we've seen her be a little bit softer, she says that since she got Omega into trouble, it's her job to get her out of it, which I think I appreciate. The character of Sid is a little one note, basically all the time, but what I like is that even though we spent very little time with her, she's just really a side character most of the time. We've spent enough time with her and enough elements where we've seen her connect with Omega or vice versa that this is a believable thing to say, or for her to put herself in this much danger, despite her frosty exterior. She does have a soft spot. So back we go to the cavern, and by the way, I like how they set this up earlier. There's this kind of upward camera angle when they're going through the cavern the first time, and you see this kind of opening at the top. And I was like, ooh, I wonder if that's going to come into play later. It does, because they use that opening, that kind of crack in the cave, to rappel down into. So they have the ship, they have the Marauder hover, and I like the visual of kind of having it hover, kind of like a Black Hawk or something. I just think it's a cool visual. Wrecker finds the first crate, and by the way, I also like how he's kind of annoyed by having to just be like, he's constantly having to like jump from high places all the time. But what I do appreciate about Wrecker is that he's always willing to face his fears. He's not afraid to admit that he's afraid, but he's still going to do what has to be done. And that's, I think, it's maybe played for laughs, but it's an admirable quality in a character. So they make their way down, and they find the first crate. But while he's doing it, he makes he steps on something. By the way, I thought this would be like he'd step on this, and this is where another action set piece sits in. It doesn't go that way. But again, the sound design is so gross. This kind of like crunchy, squeaking, squealing sound, really gross. So they find and secure the first crate while Wrecker looks for the rest. Cut back to Sid's, and Omega is now tied up with Roland, and she's eyeing up a blaster that that the Pikes have left kind of on the counter. And Roland's looking dejected, and he tells Omega not to bother. By the way, this is good advice because they left that there as bait, and if you try it, they will kill you. And he tells her the same thing, that don't even bother, they'll kill her. And that in a rather, I think, shocking moment of self-delusion and hypocrisy, he tells her that, quote, "If your friends don't return with the spice, we'll both be dead, and that's what happens when you meddle in other people's business." Now, of course, and by the way, Omega calls him out for this, he was the one meddling in other people's business to begin with, right? He came in and, pushes around Sid and her kind of her organization, and kind of makes a power play and just says, "Too bad, this is mine now." And he references, by the way, his mother and her motto for the family, for the Durand family, of taking what you want, which, by the way, a little uninspired, but, it is what it is. I mean, to be fair, Crime Boss is not the most original idea to begin with, and as people and as characters generally, they're not the most creative either. So it is what it is. And I just like this whole little exchange here. I think it's a nice moment of personalizing a villain that had really been kind of crappy up until this moment. And she asks, like, so your mom's a criminal too? And he's kind of like offended by this kind of like casual language. I just think it's a kind of a nice moment. And then Omega and Ruby share this kind of tender moment. And by the way, because Ruby likes Omega, this is kind of one of the ways that that he kind of warms up to Omega a little bit, because obviously Roland has a strong connection to Ruby. So back at the cavern in the cave, Wrecker and Sid have found the final crates, but it's almost nightfall. Echo, by the way, who I don't feel like has gotten his due necessarily this season. He's kind of just there. He's kind of just, you don't feel like he has his kind of sweet spot on the team. He fills a lot of the same role that Tech fills, but is also kind of just a droid. So I guess he's maybe filling the role that a droid would normally fill, but he has a little bit more character and he can actually speak English. So that's nice, I suppose. So anyway, Echo reminds Tech that, hey, Nightfall's coming. Those creatures are going to be up right away. And luckily, Tech has a backup plan. He's zapping away at something. He's always building something. And as Wrecker and Sid are lifted back up with the final crates, they accidentally knock one of the mine carts off that they were previously using off its track, causing the Earlings to absolutely swarm them. So they're under attack, by the way, and Wrecker is just freaking out here. He's kind of holding. By the way, he almost fell off of the crate already, and he's holding and trying to blast them. There's this green goop blood stuff all over them. But again, this kind of action sequence doesn't even last that long. And I, by the way, don't think it's that even that visually impressive. It's just fine. And luckily, Tech finishes his kind of device, whatever it is. It turns out to be this kind of light bomb. It's not really clear how that works. And this, by the way, scares all the Earlings away and long enough for everyone to get to safety. So everyone's fine. Wrecker's a little shaken up. And I love his line delivery here where he's like, I'm okay. Whew. And I just, again, coming back to just his ability to kind of constantly face his fears, it's admirable. A character that I really didn't like when I first was introduced to him. So back at the spaceport, the squad returns and delivers the spikes. The Pikes are satisfied. They let Omega go, but they are not done with Roland yet. Omega and Sid try to convince them not to kill him, with Sid probably making the best argument because she reminds them that by killing him, they'd be starting a war with another crime family. And I like how she's like talking in their language. She's like, you don't want that heat right now. Like she knows what they're doing or what their plays are. So she kind of can give them advice about how they should or shouldn't act. Now, not usually a thing I would suggest doing with any criminal organization, telling what they should do. But, and by the way, they don't really listen to her here because the Pikes say they don't accept bad deals. And it looks like they're about to decapitate Roland, which, by the way, a thing that the show has done before. So I was willing to believe that they would do it again. But instead of decapitating him with his massive knife, instead he just cuts off one of his horns. Now, I guess I don't know what it is with the Veronians, but there is something. Every time we meet one, they seem to either have a missing horn or two, or in the process of watching them in their adventures, losing one or two. So this kind of, maybe this is like a callback to the kind of like losing a hand thing that was going on, losing a limb thing that was going on in Star Wars for a while. Similar to that, Demeronians always lose a horn or two. Anyway, so he loses a horn. It looks painful. Omega, he comes up to him. She asks him if he's okay. She returns Ruby. He's happy about that. And he has one small line. He's very dejected. He looks completely crushed. So I got to give props to the animation team for kind of making that come through. And he just says it's a small price to pay. And he leaves. And I think likely, and I saw online on Twitter people kind of speculating that, the way that they leave Roland here is kind of set up for him to return later on. And now I agree with that. But we also don't know if there's a second season of the Bad Batch. Does that mean he returns later this season? In the next 3 episodes at some point, possibly. But people online are speculating that it's a sign that it's for sure. There's for sure a season 2 because there's no way he comes back this season. Now, I've kind of been hoping that there's going to be a season 2. For a while, I've been hoping that, basically ever since the first episode of the show. That being said, I'm not holding my breath that we're guaranteed a second season of the Bad Batch, and I'm not going to take the inclusion of a character like Roland as of any kind of guarantee. So that being said, it does seem like he's set up for coming back later. So who knows? Sid offers to cover the first round back at the parlor, and so the squad rushes off. But Hunter and Omega stay behind for a brief moment, and he asks her why she stuck up for him. She says she doesn't really know, but that if Ruby liked him, that he couldn't be all bad. Now, I like this moment because I think it speaks to the lesson of the whole episode, which is that there is good in all of us. There's good in everyone. Now, this is a theme for a lot of Star Wars. Obviously, Vader comes to mind. Luke and him believing that there's still good in him, right? But speaking to this episode specifically, I mean, we know that we find that Roland has a bit of a soft spot, but also so does Sid, right? So I think there's something to be said. That being said, the Pikes don't apparently, or seem to, but that's fine because they're just the villains. So anyway. I thought this episode was fine. It's fine. It's a fine episode. I've been saying, hey, it's not fair to call something a filler. This isn't a filler. This felt more like a filler episode. I don't like that term. I try not to use it, but if I had to use it, this would be the episode I'd use it on. Just because it really doesn't move the plot forward very much, especially because Sid gets her parlor back at the end. It's like, hey, if Sid had lost her parlor and their connection to work and security is gone, right? And that was the new normal as we move forward. That's fascinating, and then by the way, moves the kind of overall plot of the story forward. This episode doesn't really. This episode starts and ends, and everyone's in the exact same position they were in. From a character perspective, maybe Sid has grown a little bit. But basically everyone else is the same. Omega was trusting of her from before. Hunter was wary but willing to work with her. These are all things that are still true and really really unchanged. I don't think they're even really that much more reinforced because she, by the way, continued to withhold information from them. So anyway, I think it's fine. It's a fine episode. I'd give it maybe, if I had to score it, I'd give it maybe a 5 out of 10. It's just average, at probably at best. So that's unfortunate, but I think the show continues to impress from a visual standpoint, and I like that they're not they're willing to kind of use new environments. I mean, sure, we're stayed on Ormantel, but that doesn't mean we spent all the episode in Sid's bar. So just showing that they're willing to spread their wings a little bit too is nice. And some of the visuals are cool, but again, not my favorite. So next week, the episode's title is War Mantle. Now, we don't know what the final 2 episode titles are, but we do know that War Mantle is the name of the program that Admiral Rampart started when he thought about bringing in, regular people into the Grand Army of the Republic / Imperial Army / Navy, whatever you want to call it. So, obviously, this has, ramifications for the clones. We still don't know what the outcome of the clone situation is going to be. There's a couple things hanging up in the air. What's going to be resolved this season if there is a second season? If there isn't, they have quite a few things they need to wrap up. They need to wrap up the Crosshair plot. How's he? What happens to him? Does he get redeemed? Does he commit fully to the Empire stuff? What happens with Omega? Why is she so valuable and different? We've been hinting that she's Force sensitive, but there's no been any real proof, nothing concrete necessarily. A lot of hearsay, a lot of speculation. I think fairly founded speculation, but nothing concrete. And what else? I mean, what happened to all the clones? Why did they get retired? We haven't seen that moment yet, and I think if this story is asking for that to be resolved. So And I think that'll probably have something to do with Hauser and the whole situation on Ryloth. So there's lots for them to wrap up. They have 3 episodes to do it. They have personal stuff to deal with Crosshair and Omega, and then there's larger kind of overarching story stuff with Star Wars and world-building stuff that they need to kind of wrap up as well, including if or if not we're going to get a Clone Rebellion. I'm still leaning on to yes, that we will. So anyway, that's next week. We'll be back, and I'll be on vacation until Monday, so there shouldn't be any issue with recording Monday. And Rachel should be back then as well, and we'll be able to dive deep into what I think is going to be the first of a 3-part finale for the season, and I think a pretty good one. So stay tuned for that, and we'll be back with more small screen Star Wars very soon.